Hi, my name is Marissa Purcell, and I'm the head curator here at the James Whitcomb Riley Boyhood Home and Museum. Today we're going to talk about Elizabeth Marine Riley and the Victorian mother. What Elizabeth Marine Riley was like while she was raising James Whitcomb Riley and his siblings, and what would have been expected her during the time period she was raising them. And what was it like to be a kid during that time? So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Elizabeth Marine Riley was the mother of James Whitcomb Riley. She was born in 1823 here in Randolph County, Indiana. She was the youngest child born to John and Esther, maiden name Jones Marine. She grew up in Randolph County all of her life. Growing up, she was kind of the baby of the family. She was the one who was I wouldn't say spoiled, but she was the one that was always well taken care of. On the 20th of February, 1844, when she was a young woman, she married Reuben Alexander Riley, and later that year in 1844, they ended up moving to Greenfield, Indiana. That was a prime location for Reuben. He was a lawyer, and Hancock County was a part of the Indianapolis Circuit at that point. And so that meant that there was a lot of opportunity for Reuben in his law practice. Later that year in 1844, their first child, John Andrew Riley, is born. So Elizabeth was the mother of 6 children. Her firstborn was John Andrew in 1844, followed by Martha Celestia in 1847, James Whitcomb Riley in 1849, Ella May in 1856, Reuben Alexander Humboldt in 1859, and Mary Elizabeth in 1864. Unfortunately, I am blocking out some of those dates, but those are the 6 children that were born to Elizabeth and Reuben. In this picture, you see 5 of the siblings. You see John Andrew. James Whitcomb Riley's the gentleman standing up in the back. His hand is on the shoulder of Mary Elizabeth with Ella May, and Alexander Humboldt is the little boy. Elizabeth Marine Riley's characteristics. So what was she like? What made her stand out in James Whitcomb Riley's memory? Fondly, she was known to write poetry, so she often inspired James Whitcomb Riley to write his own poetry. She inspired and nurtured that love of prose in him and would often encourage that particular gift that he had. She was very superstitious in nature. That was actually quite common in Indiana and on the frontier, passed down from previous generations to carry some of those superstitions from the old country with you. She believed in fairies. She would talk about fairies and goblins and pixies, and would talk about the fog rolling in off of the fields in the morning. And she passed down that love, I wouldn't say love, but that knowledge of superstitions on to James Whitcomb Riley. James Whitcomb Riley also was superstitious himself, and that came from his mother. She inspired a love for music in her children. Elizabeth Riley knew how to play instruments. She knew how to play the organ, and she passed down that love of musical instruments to her children. A lot of her children knew how to play instruments. John Andrew knew how to play the cornet. James Whitcomb Riley knew how to play the banjo, the guitar. He knew how to play the snare drum as well. And then we know that James Whitcomb Riley's brother Humboldt, he also played the snare drum. And James Whitcomb Riley's niece, Mary Elizabeth's daughter, Leslie Payne, she actually played the violin in the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra later on in her life. James Whitcomb Riley also knew how to play the violin, but he wasn't quite as good at it. He would often complain that his thumb didn't know where to go on the violin like it did the banjo or the guitar. Elizabeth was known to be a kind woman, a very generous woman. She always had a kind word to say to people. She always had the right words to say in a situation, and that made her very well respected in the Greenfield community. She was very fondly remembered. James Wickham Riley remembered his mother very well in A Child World, one of his poems. He remembers her with fair hair glimmering, rose leaf cheeks and dewy lips. She was mild, plain, had a fair face, and had a luminous joy when glad. Um, so she was a very bright, delightful person with a bright outlook on life. And he kind of remembered her as being this bright personality that he put on a pedestal. His favorite place to find her was when she was often enthroned in her rocking chair on the side porch at their boyhood home. So at the boyhood home, we have a side porch on the side. It's now enclosed, but when he was growing up, it would have been open. She had her rocking chair on there, which we have upstairs in the boyhood home currently. And she would have been either doing the chores, preparing for dinner, mending. She would have been in that rocking chair a lot. That way, not only could she do the chores she needed to do, but keep an eye on the children as they were playing. The well was located right outside of the porch, and so she probably also would have sat in her rocking chair before she would have gone and started the morning chores. That way she could have also kept an eye on the kids as they're doing their chores as well. Make sure James and John and weren't getting into trouble. John, known as Jaunty, James, Bud, there was also an apple orchard that way, so it also meant that if they were getting into trouble in the apple orchard, she could keep an eye on it as well. She was known to be an industrious woman. She did have help around the house, but that never stopped her from doing her own chores. And when it came to entertaining, she was a gracious hostess. So what was expected of a Victorian mother during this time period? In the Victorian area, Victorian mothers were primarily expected to be homemakers and caregivers. That was their primary role. Women really did not work outside of the house during this period. You were expected to be home. If you had a role outside of the house, usually it was a business that was attached to the house and you're helping your husband, or you're running it, but you're also maintaining the house at the same time. Or you're unusual and you might be an eccentric spinster. So that was their main role, was to be keeping their environment clean. The home was their territory while the men go to work. They were supposed to keep it clean and comfortable, keep their families fed, manage any servants that one might have, and to raise their children accordingly. They were also managing their child's education. So Elizabeth Riley did manage the Riley children's education. They were homeschooled up until a certain point, until the public school was built here in Greenfield. Once the public school was built here in Greenfield, then they were sent off to the public school. But until then, it was Elizabeth who was in charge of their education. And the education not only consisted of raising and nurturing the child, but providing moral guidance. So the Bible would have been used as a compass for the day. It would have been as a compass for life. You would have been educating the child to read, to write, to do arithmetic, making sure that they were actually learning good societal manners. You can't send out your child into society without proper manners. You don't want them to become a burden to society, and if you're not teaching them proper manners inside the home, later on they could potentially become a burden. And then how to properly dress your child. So that was also a big one, educating not only the child in how they should be dressing, it also shows you as a mother, you know what you're doing because you're dressing your child appropriately. Maintaining the household, this would include keeping the house clean, doing all the chores, the laundry, making sure that's done. They didn't have washing machines, so laundry took a lot longer. They had less of it. They did not have near the laundry that we have today. Their closets, which were called presses, were literally that deep, that wide. So you didn't have the amount of clothing one would have, but that was good because, again, it took a lot longer. So she would have been helping with the laundry. She would have been in charge of making sure the house was dusted, making sure that all of the food is ready to go. On the side porch to the pantry, there's a door to the pantry. She would have made sure that all of the food was put in there properly. Preparing the meals, she would have worked alongside any hired help they had. We do know that the Rileys had some hired help from time to time. James Whitcomb Riley has a character in his poems called Elizabeth Ann. In fact, our kitchen rental space, Elizabeth Ann's Kitchen, is named after her. She was a conglomeration of multiple different women that they had over the years that would come and help with the kitchen and the household to help Elizabeth as she was preparing everything. She would have had 2 different kitchens. So the Riley home, back when James Whitcomb Riley was a boy, had 2 kitchens. There would have been the winter kitchen and the summer kitchen. The summer kitchen would have been a detached home structure just behind the house. That way it didn't overheat the house during the summer. And obviously the winter kitchen, you wanted to keep your house warm for the winter. So she would have been cooking in there in the winter. She's making sure the meals are prepared, all of the vegetables are canned, everything like that is being managed. And then just regular household management as well, like, oh, I just noticed that part of the roof came off. I'm going to have to tell the person who represented the Raggedy Man in the poems. Again, those were several different people that James remembered growing up. That fit the characteristics of the Raggedy Man. So she would have been in charge of making sure that they were aware that certain repairs needed to be done around the property. Reuben, because he was a lawyer traveling the Indianapolis circuit, which included Hancock County, Marion County, Hamilton County, Hancock, and Hendricks, and Johnson, meant that he would have been traveling not only representing people, but he probably would have been called upon to be judge a time or two, meant he was not home very often. And when James Whitcomb Riley was born, when he was a baby in 1849, Reuben was actually serving in the Indiana State Legislature. So that meant Reuben was not home hardly at all, which means that it was really Elizabeth who was making sure everything was being maintained on the property. Life could be rough for a Victorian mother. Just like today, there were things that would pop up, but usually in the Victorian era, they were dealing with a lot of things that in today's day and age we don't have to think about anymore. According to Teresa O'Neill's book, Ungovernable, a Victorian Parent's Guide to Raising Perfect Children. I did not want to spell that title out, but I do have that in the works cited later on if you're interested in reading that book. There were between 40 to 70 maternal deaths and 1,000 childbirths. The child mortality rate was 50%. Elizabeth and Reuben did experience this. We know based on dates separated between the kids, there were probably chances that Elizabeth had multiple miscarriages over her lifetime. We also know that Martha Celeste, as I showed you in a picture earlier in this video, I showed you a picture of 5 of the siblings, but there was a 6th one missing. Unfortunately, Martha Celeste died as a toddler. So the Rileys did unfortunately experience the child mortality rate and losing their little girl. Later on, as a young adult, they would lose Humboldt as well. He ended up passing away from typhoid fever. Martha Celeste passed away from scarlet fever. So it was a thing back then where Victorian mothers, they would get excited about their pregnancies and they would get excited about raising their children, but there was always that thing lurking in the back of their mind that there's going to be a potential of something might take them away from me. Constantly. Mothers were viewed as the angel of the house. They were often modeled so much that they were put on pedestals, and that can be hard for anybody to be put on a pedestal, and that would take an extra toll on you. As I mentioned before, they often experienced miscarriages. That could come from not good nutrition, like if there was a lack of nutrition, different environmental factors. Sometimes the medicines they thought were helping them were actually harming them. There was a lot going on in the Victorian era. A lot of times medicines would hide alcohol, so that was a thing that was a common drink during that time, just on a daily basis, was alcohol. That did not mean that they were alcoholics. It just meant that that was what was safer to drink, because a lot of the water was polluted. So it could also be diet as well. And you were also responsible for the little one's health, both body and soul, and that was a big responsibility. Not only were you supposed to keep the child healthy and nutritious here on earth, but you were also supposed to be keeping their soul healthy and nutritious for their heavenly purposes as well. And so it was a bit, there was a lot to be juggling as a Victorian mother. And then for Elizabeth, a significant event happened, the Civil War. So during James Whitcomb Riley's young teenage years, Civil War broke out when he was 11. Civil War between the North and the South. Shots were fired on Fort Sumter. It was a very stressful time to be alive, because you didn't know what was happening, and the country was kind of turmoil. It was falling apart. You had the southern states seceding because of states' rights. They felt like states' rights were being violated. And so men were being called upon to go and fight. Reuben, James Whitcomb Riley's father, actually enlisted. The first time he volunteered. And then the second time, after his volunteer period ended, he enlisted as a captain in the cavalry. Again, that means for Elizabeth, Reuben's gone a majority of the time, even more than he was before, because now he's gone years at a time. And not only is she managing the house, but her oldest children, Jonty and Bud, James and John, are teenagers. And so they're able to help her out more, but there's also that element of, now I've got teenagers that I have to deal with. So she's managing the house, she's making sure it runs properly, and she's doing a good job. Before Reuben left for the Civil War, he did leave Elizabeth Riley somebody who could help her. At that point, because they weren't sure what was going on, there wasn't exactly extra money lying around. They could only pay this girl room and board, and her name was Mary Alice Smith. Her father came to Reuben and asked Reuben if the Rileys would take her in. So Mary Alice Smith came to live with them, and she was put in charge of the children, and her nickname was Allie. So the Riley children knew her as Allie, and she is the inspiration for Little Orphan Annie. Little Orphan Annie's come to our house today to wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away. And when all the supper things is done, we sit around the fire and have the mostest fun. Listen to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. It's a very paraphrased version of that poem, but she's the inspiration. She was not, in fact, orphaned. Her father was alive. He was fighting in the Civil War, and the reason it's Little Orphan Annie instead of Allie is there was a typo made with the editor, but she is the inspiration for James Whitcomb Riley. She would help Elizabeth not only manage the children, but she would help with the cooking, she'd help with some of the chores, and that would help Elizabeth get some of the things done that some of the children weren't able to do. Mary Alice Smith did not stay with the Rileys very long. One of the reasons was Bud. James did not appreciate her being put in charge of him, and so he would be pulling pranks on her constantly. She was annoyed with him, he was annoyed with her, and so that kind of led to some butting heads. But when she was with the Rileys, she helped Elizabeth significantly. Reuben ends up going and fighting in the Civil War, as I mentioned, and in early on in the war, as he was a volunteer, because he first enlisted or volunteered, and then later on, as his volunteer portion ended, he ended up enlisting in the cavalry as a captain. During his volunteer portion, during the Civil War, early on in about mid-1861, he's involved in a battle called Rich Mountain in Virginia, and which is now part of West Virginia. In that battle, he is wounded. He had a shell explode over his head, and he's paralyzed on his left side temporarily, and he loses his hearing in his left ear permanently. He never fully recovers from that. The rest of the time he's in the Union Army, he's dealing with repercussions from that injury. He ends up having dysentery off and on his whole entire time in the Union Army. I just recently learned that he was involved in more battles in Tennessee than we realized. His particular unit was near a lot of the big fighting happening in Tennessee. Reuben comes home a changed man. He is suffering from what we would now consider PTSD. At that time, they didn't really know what to call it. He just came home kind of melancholia, as they would say. World War I would have said shell shock. Again, PTSD today. He was suffering from post-traumatic syndrome disorder. He comes home and he's a different person. Not only is he a different person, but the people he left are different people too. They've been fending for themselves. His oldest boys, Jonty and Bud, are now young men. Jonty is approaching adulthood. Bud, James, also affectionately known as Jamesy, he's about 14, 15. Elva May's getting older. She's still a young girl, but she's also getting older as well. And Humboldt is a headstrong little boy. They're different. They're different people once he's discharged, honorably discharged because of his war wounds in the latter part of 1863, as I mentioned. Not only that, but Elizabeth's different. She's older now too, and she's been managing the house for a long time without Reuben. Reuben comes home. He decides he wants a change. He's not into his law practice really anymore. It's suffering. And he goes, you know what? Let's change. Let's move somewhere where we can start and have a new life, and I don't have to remember what happened. So he buys farmland in Kansas, and he decides that they're going to go out and they're going to farm that land. And so he ends up selling the property here in Greenfield, the boyhood home where James Whitcomb Riley grew up, really before he lets the family know. But back then, during the Victorian period, that was normal. The man was the final decision maker. Whatever the man decided to do, the rest of the family would follow, especially the woman, because everything that was the woman's was her husband's. She didn't really have, she didn't have rights to property. She didn't have those things, so it was expected of her that whatever her husband was going to do, she was going to do too. As the Bible says, I'm becoming one with you, and wherever you go, I go. Well, Elizabeth's been managing things by her own, and I think she's starting to wonder, well, I've been doing such a good job, though, and all of my family's here, my roots are here. Indiana's my home. So when he announces that he sold the property, he sold the farm on the west side of Greenfield, they're going to move to Kansas, Elizabeth actually defies what's normal standards of a woman for the Victorian time period and actually tells Reuben no. She's not going to Kansas. Her life is in Indiana. She's watched Greenfield go from a tiny frontier town to a bustling village, soon to be city, and she's not going. She says no to moving to Kansas. And it's the start of that you start to have a little bit of dissension in the Riley family. When James Whitcomb Riley was growing up, there was peace, there was harmony. He had the ideal childhood. And then all of a sudden, as a young teenager, it's a completely disrupted, and he sees a different side to his parents that he's never seen before. And he sees his parents actually having conflict. Because Reuben's not going to give up on his farm in Kansas. It was always believed here at the Riley home that the reason Reuben had to sell the boyhood home was because he couldn't pay the back taxes on it and that he couldn't afford to keep the boyhood home any longer and that they had to go live in poverty. Well, it's actually looking like now that he was being more stubborn because he kept the land in Kansas until 1870. If they really were having financial trouble, I think he would have sold that land too. If you are Elizabeth, can you imagine what it would have been like to have had your household that you're running? You're one of the top members of society in Greenfield. You're hosting people in your own home, and all of a sudden it's taken away from you. You're pregnant because in 1864 she's pregnant with Mary Elizabeth. Your husband's come home early 1864, whether he talked to you or not. He's sold the farm. So heavy pregnant. We don't know if they were told that they had to leave right away or not, but heavy pregnant, you've just lost everything. Your husband has lost everything. He's insisting on going to Kansas. And now one of the things we know is at some point they move in with Andrew's mother, Margaret Riley. And now you're living with your mother-in-law. And you don't have your own household anymore. And you have a couple moody teenagers on your hands, especially James Whitcomb Riley, because he's lost his home too. That would have been very hard for Elizabeth. Because of that, we end up having conflict just with the rest of Elizabeth's days. I do think that things got easier for the Rileys. But I do know that James Whitcomb Riley never forgave his father for selling the boyhood home. And so James Whitcomb Riley, in a time of his life as a young teenager when he should be growing closer to his father, he grows closer to his mother. Elizabeth Riley was James Whitcomb Riley's pillar. She was the pillar of his life. She was his inspiration. She was the one that he was closest to in temperament. All of the Riley kids looked up to Elizabeth. They were all very, very close to her. And when in 1870, which again, as I mentioned, we've kind of learned recently that Reuben kept the land in Kansas until 1870. I think Reuben kept holding on to the thought that one of these days Elizabeth was going to give in and they were going to go start a new life in Kansas. Unfortunately, that was not to be. August of 1870, Elizabeth Riley passes away. Elizabeth had probably been suffering from heart problems, probably the majority of the latter part of her life. She kind of hadn't been doing well, in Riley's memory anyway, based on later interviews he gave. And he always blamed it on the fact that his father was not being nice to his mom. He didn't go into specifics of what that was, but now we know that it had to do with the fact that Reuben was holding on to land in Kansas and probably pressuring Elizabeth to move out there. In August of 1870, she ends up passing away from congestive heart failure. And that's the kind of the beginning of the complete fracturing of the Riley family. They hang on to each other and they love each other dearly, but there is a fracturing that happens after Elizabeth's death. So on Tuesday morning, Elizabeth gets up. She's not feeling well. She kind of paces, and then Reuben hears a thump and looks over and notices that she is on the floor unconscious. And they put her in bed. One of the children is sent for the doctor. Because of their ages, it was probably James or John who were sent. And unfortunately, they're not able to do anything. And by 7 o'clock that morning, she's gone. It's devastating for the kids. They're lost without her. Because really, she was the parent who was home all the time. And their dad came home different. So much so that John Riley ends up writing in a letter of his, "What shall we do with James now that mother is gone?" That's how close James was to Elizabeth. So as a Victorian woman, she was the epitome of what a Victorian woman should be. She should be held in high regard by her husband and her children, and nobody had a bad word to say about her. That is what the Victorian women were striving for. So with that, Elizabeth is well remembered in our memory. She is well remembered as being one of the main inspirations for James Whitcomb Riley. She had to deal with a lot, especially on frontier Indiana, that she had to manage. Just not only with the chores that you were expected to do, but as well as raising the children, guiding them in the way they should go. Again, the biggest thing out of the Victorian era is you do not want your child to be a social problem. And that was your big goal. She is a bit of an enigma. We do not know more personal details about her, unfortunately. A lot of personal details that could be known about Elizabeth may have been lost to time. Later on, Reuben's house that he owned here in Greenfield on Pennsylvania and State Street burned down. And we believe it burned down before the kids had a lot of time to get a lot of the family heirlooms out of the house. So unless they're in a collection somewhere, we just don't know a lot about her own personal thoughts herself, but we do know her integrity that she passed down to her children. I appreciate you going ahead and stopping to view this particular video. If you like our videos, click like, click subscribe, and we'll be happy to have you follow us, as well as be looking out for more content. I'm always making more content for our viewers to watch. So with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. My name is Marissa Purcell.